The season that was and the season to come with Brandon and Dan from the What the Puck podcast. Next on Locked On Caps.
Your Locked On Capitals, your daily podcast on the Washington Capitals. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Well, hello and welcome into this edition of Locked On Capitals. I'm so glad you decided to join me today. As always, this podcast is free and available on all the major platforms. And I want to thank you for making this your first listen or view of the day. Yes, this podcast is also available in video form, so head on over to YouTube and check it out. My name is Dan Holme. You can find me on Twitter. It's at DanCaps218. You can find the show on Twitter. It's at Locked On Caps. Today's episode is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your first purchase. So in this edition of Locked On Capitals, I am joined by Brandon and Dan of the What the Puck podcast in the first part of this interview here. And we talk about, could Brian Maclellan have salvaged last season? Listen, he knew that this team was facing a myriad of injuries. Was there something he could have done to potentially have saved the season? And then we'll talk about Peter Laviolette and his comments about people saying he is reluctant to play younger players. He will address that, and we'll talk about that in this episode. And then we'll talk about, where did the Capitals go going forward with this aging core? And did the Caps hang on to this roster too long? So in this edition of Locked On Capitals, like I say, I have Brandon and Dan of the What the Puck podcast, and I talk to them next. Brandon and Dan, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much for having us.
Yeah, thanks for having us back.
It's great to have you guys back on here. So let's just talk about this past season here. Obviously, it didn't go according to script. When I looked at last season, in the offseason, I saw they signed Darcy Kemper. I saw they signed Charlie Lindgren. They signed Dylan Strome and Connor Brown. And I thought this team was loaded for bear. And as it turns out, injuries threw a curveball at the Capitals as they faced a myriad of different injuries. You know, we're a little bit removed here from this past season here. So when we reflect on this past season, Dan, I'll start with you. What went wrong with this team? Was it just injuries, or did Peter Laviolette lose the locker room?
I mean, I definitely think it was a little bit of both. I don't know if I would go so far as to say he lost the locker room, but I think if we want to talk about Laviolette, I think what he wanted to do and what the players were capable of were just two different things. And I think it's almost a situation, I think Brandon and I talked about it on our show before, that like, if you look at Tortorella when he was in Vancouver, right? Like everywhere else he went, he succeeded in some way, shape, or form. Not necessarily winning cups at all of those stops, but he succeeded. The teams that he was with got better, except in Vancouver. I think with Laviolette, he's clearly a very talented hockey coach. I don't think anyone can argue against that point. But for whatever reason, it just didn't work here in DC. I think he did make some players better. I think some players weren't able to progress. And I think when you have an aging core like the Capitals have, and you have the injuries that they have, you have to be able to incorporate the young guys. And I thought there was an interesting comment after the season where Laviolette kind of not threw the young guys under the bus, but he was kind of like, well, they weren't good enough. Obviously, I'm paraphrasing here. And I thought, well, okay, that's fair. But then your choice was to kind of throw in these older dudes who also weren't good enough. And then you just kept doing that. So it's somewhere at some point, they didn't make a change. And I put that on Laviolette. I'll put that on Maclellan as well. Like everyone could see it wasn't working. Yes, injuries played a part. They knew Wilson was going to be out. They knew Backstrom was out for an indefinite amount of time. They weren't sure, I imagine they weren't sure when he was coming back. So they brought in Connor Brown. Great idea. He gets injured at the beginning of the season. You're like, whoops. All right. We need a new plan. And they never really came up with one. Like we never saw them make that big move to, unless I'm forgetting somebody, to make that big move to fix the issue. Like they knew Connor Brown was done for the season. Like, there was no going, he might return. Like we knew he was out, and they knew Wilson was out for a while. Why did they not go and try and make a move? I don't think this would have had to give up everything and risk the future for that kind of move. But why didn't they try something? They tried to bring up young guys. It didn't work. They brought in old guys. That didn't, not old guys. That sounds mean. They're like my age. That didn't work. And so it was like, they never really made the big move to try and fix the problem. And they basically, it's the definition of insanity. They kept doing the same thing over and over and expected a different result. And so it's injuries. It's Laviolette didn't work. It was just anything that could have gone wrong last season. It felt like, with the exception of Ovechkin scoring goals, went wrong.
Brandon, I'll go to you next here. Was there something that Brian Maclellan or Peter Laviolette could have done to help salvage this last season? For me, even if Tom Wilson was there the entire season, Nick Backstrom and John Carlson, for me, I think that team was a wild card team at best. Where do you weigh in? Do you think that they have a higher ceiling? And do you think that the GM could have done anything to salvage the past season?
I don't think there's anything that he could have done to salvage the season, just from the sheer fact that he was up against the wall with the cap. He had no other money to spend, and he thought that the big issue was the young goaltenders, and he made that change last offseason, bringing in 2 goaltenders that, for the most part, did what they were supposed to do this year. We had a clear number 1, we had a clear number 2 goaltender, and he addressed those issues. And then we got into this season, and those issues that we had still persisted. So I think Brian Maclellan did the right thing at the trade deadline, because I think he kind of realized at that point, all right, this season's over. We're not doing what we need to do. They were always behind the 8 ball. It was always injuries. There was always something that was holding them back. And on our show, What the Puck, I think that Dan and I actually brought this up earlier on one of the episodes, that Laviolette, he came in during COVID, during those pandemic years. He never really had a shot to make this team his own. He always had these roadblocks. And like Dan said before, that happened with every other team in the league. That's completely true. But this team was plagued with injuries, was plagued with, COVID outbreaks. And this season, could it have been different? Maybe, but if you've got an aging core, if you've got a coach who doesn't want to include young players into his lineup, then you're kind of stuck at that point. And I think this last season was a ride the wave until it's over type of deal, and then start fresh next year. I mean, I do have high hopes of what's on the horizon, but this past season, I think it really was like, we're stuck. We have no more money to spend. We have these big name players that we invest a lot of money in. They're not playing. So we kind of have to deal with what we have to deal with. And it was not a good time for any player, any coach, any fan to really watch last season. It was just kind of like let's get by the skin of our teeth and hope for the best.
And one of the things that was interesting is, after the season was done, I think a lot of this kind of got back to Peter Laviolette about his quote unquote reluctance to go younger. And he said, listen, maybe you guys aren't a fan of history. You didn't see what I did in Nashville. He goes, I had a lot of young players in there. I just wasn't really impressed with the young players that the Capitals had. And touche, seems like when McMichael had his opportunity, he didn't make the most of it. You take a look at Joe Snively. He's someone that made the most of his opportunities. So some of these guys that are lauded as, the next greatest thing, like LaPierre, it seems sometimes they shoot themselves in the foot when they finally do get their opportunity. But all right, so coming up, we talk about how do the Capitals turn it around and be competitive in a hurry like next season, and can this aging core still compete? So one of the things that's frustrating is finding tickets for those events in your area the tickets are hard to come by. Buying tickets to your favorite events shouldn't be stressful. Game Time is the fast and easy way to buy tickets for all the sports, music, comedy, and theater near you, with killer deals on last-minute tickets and their best price guarantee. You can stop stressing over tickets and start getting hyped about the fun that you'll have. Snag the tickets without stress with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off. Create a Game Time account. Last minute tickets, lowest prices guaranteed. Taking a look at this team and where they're going forward here. This past season here was the first time they missed the playoffs since 2014. It was the Adam Oates era, if you remember. And we're talking about an aging core. We take a look at Backstrom, 35, Alex Ovechkin, 37, TJ Oshie, 36, John Carlson, 33, all holdovers from the 2018 Stanley Cup winning season. And oftentimes I pose the question to different people, how does this team get to be competitive next year? You know, are they going to get aggressive? And they'll go, yeah, I think they should get aggressive. And I'll say, really? What should they do? And they'll go, I think they should trade Mantha. Okay. I think they're going to trade Kuznetsov. Is that going to make your team better? Listen, for me, when I did this show, I talked about my 3 untouchables, Alex Ovechkin, John Carlson, and Tom Wilson. And for the rest of them, I think they should be willing to at least listen to offers. Dan, I'll start with you here on this. How crazy and aggressive should the Capitals get if they want to be competitive next season?
If they want to be competitive next season, they have to be aggressive through the trade market. Everything we're reading is that the free agent market's not that great. There's no need to get into what's clearly going to be a market where you have top name guys that are out there. They're going to get a lot of money and you don't have the cap space to spend that. Why not go and find someone who's already got a contract, be it for one season or multiple seasons, that you can bring in through trade? They have some guys that aren't working out here in DC. They've got some guys that allegedly want out. And so is there an opportunity for the Capitals to make a move there? I think you have to be aggressive, and I think they can be aggressive because of the moves they made at the trade deadline. If you compare the Caps and the Penguins, as we've been doing for the last, 15 years, that you can see they were both in the same spot, both not having great seasons. Penguins decided to just go for it and try and make the playoffs. And Cap said, you know what? We're kind of not very good. Let's try and retool a little bit here and get some draft capital. And that's how they ended up with Sandin. They had an opportunity to trade away a first-round pick that wasn't theirs and bring in a player that's clearly going to do, knock on wood, very well for this team going forward. And so I think they have to do the same thing. They have now these additional trade pieces, be it prospects, be it picks, be it guys on the NHL roster now that they can move out to be able to bring someone else in. You talked to Mantha or Kuznetsov. I think the first thing they have to do is figure out what style of hockey they're going to play next season and see if those guys will fit into it. But I think it's going to depend on a number of factors and what other teams are looking to do. I think Toronto is someone everyone's going to be looking at in terms of seeing what they might be able to get from there, given whatever they're doing. And so I definitely think they have to be aggressive, or as aggressive as they can be without risking, the prospects that they have that they think are going to be NHL quality guys, unless they're bringing in someone in their low to early to mid 20s.
All right, Brandon, I'll go to you next here. Who are your untouchables? If you had to list, I listed 3, list 3 or 4 players. Who are your untouchables on this Capitals team, and who is expendable?
Well, I really hate to be boring here, but I do agree with you. The 3 untouchables I would go with. I'd go with Alex Ovechkin, obviously. I'd go with John Carlson, and I would go with Tom Wilson. I think Tom Wilson, when Ovechkin decides he's moving on, he's not going to be a Capital anymore, he's going and playing, in the KHL for a season, or he's hanging up the skates. I think Tom Wilson's wearing that C when that happens. So those are the 3 guys I think you do want to stick around. John Carlson's just been a staple on this defense, and you need a leader on this defense, and John Carlson is that type of guy. You look at guys like Nick Backstrom and TJ Oshie, and I'm a huge fan. I mean, we all are, obviously. We are all huge fans of all of these players, but Nick Backstrom has not returned to form from what he was before this hip surgery, and it was a miracle that he came back from this hip surgery in the first place. I would hate to see him go anywhere else. I don't want to see him go anywhere else. I want him and Ovi to ride off into the sunset together in Caps jerseys and, remember all the good times and handing off the cup to Backstrom. I mean, that's a moment that's going to be etched in all of our brains forever. But what Backstrom and what Oshie do next are huge question marks. Obviously, they've got contracts here, but both of those guys spent a lot of time on the injury reserve. They weren't on the ice very often, and when they were on the ice, it kind of was like they weren't there anyway, I really should say. So I think if you're a good general manager, and I think Brian MacLellan is a general manager, these are all staples to this team. But I don't think any of us really thought Dmitry Orlov would be in a different jersey at some point in the near future, but he was already a Boston Bruin. So I think he's at least listening to conversations about any of these players. But Dan, you brought up a really good point just now. Will this new system fit better for Yevgeny Kuznetsov and Anthony Mantha and some of these older players? You got to figure out what you're going to do at head coach first. If you do have a head coach who really knows how to hone their skills and make this team special for those guys, is it the right idea to have those guys move on? I don't know. I mean, it really is. You got to answer that head coach question first before you really decide what to do with any of these other players. Because obviously a lot of these players that we're talking about, they're Stanley Cup champions. They're good players. They are talented. It's just, when they get hurt, they need extra time to be on the sidelines because, you get older, things don't heal as quickly.
So yeah, the question, and I guess the tough part is I've kind of reached and I've said Nick Backstrom is expendable and TJ Oshie is expendable, but the problem that I can see potentially is the rest of the NHL knows they're diminished goods. The rest of the NHL can see the back of their hockey card, and they can see that Nick Backstrom had a hip resurfacing procedure done. They can see that TJ Oshie is injury prone. Two players that if you had talked to me about this a couple of years ago, I would have said you're crazy for even talking about it. But how I look at it right now is maybe the Capitals held on to them too long. I think that there was change afoot, and then the Capitals kind of unexpectedly won the Stanley Cup in 2018. And they're like, well, maybe we got something here. And they've tried to squeeze as much juice as they possibly can out of this lineup. Dan, I'm going to ask you, do you think that Nick Backstrom and TJ Oshie, do you think their value is already too far diminished? Because, part of me thinks, I'm like, well, we can go out and get crazy and we'll trade Nick Backstrom and TJ Oshie and get, this big name player. But I think their value might be too far gone. What do you think? All right, coming up, we talk about the importance of Tom Wilson on this team and how the talk of trading him is crazy. And did the Caps hang on to this aging roster too long?
I agree with you in regards to those two players. I think if the Caps were a team at, this upcoming season's trade deadline and they're not making the playoffs, I think that there's a team, and Backstrom and Oshie have been healthy for the most part. I think there's a team that's making a playoff run or thinks they're going to make a long playoff run that would be interested in potentially bringing those guys in. No, I say that without having looked at their contracts. Actually, no, that would kind of make some sense. So they might go, you know what? We're going to go for broke. We're going to give you something in return for these guys. In regards to this summer, no one's going to want either one of them. And that sounds so much harder, like harsher saying that out loud than I'm intending. But like no one's going to take on their contracts and no one's going to take on their injury history and give you anything worth of value. 6th, 7th round pick, I would think maybe. But why, unless you are a rebuilding team that wants that veteran presence, that doesn't have a salary cap situation to worry about, that really needs someone to come in and help a lot of their young guys as they're rebuilding, I don't see a reason why any other general manager would want to do that. The Caps are for more or less stuck with these guys unless they decide to hang them up. And it doesn't sound like either one of them necessarily are going that route right now. Obviously, things can change over the summer, but those are two guys that really don't have any trade value right now.
Yeah, and that's the tough thing is how to proceed, because we hear that, next year we want to see McMichael in there. We want to see LaPierre in there. So let's go to McMichael, who his native position is the center position. Who comes out? Is Kuznetsov coming out? Is Backstrom coming out? Is Dowd coming out or Strome? I mean, who's coming out to put these players in there? And are they willing to pay Nick Backstrom a crazy amount of money to play a third line center position? It just kind of boggles my mind. And I think the Caps are in kind of a tough spot. Brian Maclellan has impressed me before when he signed Orpik and Niskanen, and I was really kind of impressed. And we can remember how key that was to the Capitals push in 2018 when they won the Stanley Cup. So one of the things that Mac talked about is that he wants to address the top six. And, when he was kind of pushed on it, they said the center position, the wing position, he said all of them What is the Capitals' top 6 going to look like next season? We'll start with you, Brandon.
I think the top 6, you really got to think about a guy that we didn't get to see at all last year, Connor Brown. Where is he going to fit in there? Obviously, he's a guy that still can be a huge part of this team. He was supposed to be a huge part of this team, but Connor Brown is a huge question mark. I assume he is ready to come back, if not very close to being able to come back. I think he's somebody that everyone's completely forgotten about for their top 6. But I think he's the guy that you got to think about. And you got to think of Strome, a guy that did really well with Alex Ovechkin. You weren't really expecting him to be on the same line together, but he's a name that kind of came out of nowhere. And obviously they worked really well together. You saw what Ovechkin was able to do with him at the center spot as well. So those are 2 names that are kind of surprising to think about as a top 6, but they're 2 names that I think definitely deserve to be at least in the conversation for the top 6 next season.
Yeah, and one of the crazy things that I'm hearing about there being that we're kind of coming up on crazy season and people are kind of just trying to generate stories for content. I can relate to that. But one of the things that I saw in RMNB is they talked about the possibility, and I don't have this in front of me, but I believe it was Tom Wilson for Nylander for the Maple Leafs. Is that crazy? To me, that's crazy. Under no circumstances do I ever, and I don't really care what the offer is, I would never entertain the offer right now of trading Tom Wilson, who I perceive to be the future captain of this team. There is not one of the other teams in the NHL that wouldn't love to have Tom Wilson on their team. We oftentimes hear that he's a goon, but goons don't score 20-plus goals like he did a couple of years ago. He also has that intimidation factor where sometimes he doesn't even need to drop the gloves. He'll just kind of skate in the vicinity and everything kind of disperses. Is there ever a situation right now, I know years from now would be a different conversation, is there ever a scenario for you, Dan, that you would see the Capitals be willing to trade Tom Wilson?
Well, I think if Gretzky can get traded, anybody can get traded. So, like, in regards to Wilson, like, honestly, yes, I see a situation where Wilson could be traded, but the return has to be very impressive. And it would my guess is it would be a team that is desperate to bring in some physicality and to bring in someone who's got goal scoring and a veteran presence. And that's what that team is looking for. And I think they've got to throw a lot at the Caps for them to go, you know what, this actually is better for us in the long run. Like, you can take one guy and turn him into multiple players while also likely having the idea of having someone that has his physicality that's going to be a presence in the lineup as well, because you don't want your star players and your young guys basically it's open season on hitting them during the game. Wilson comes out there and he's stop it, leave my guys alone. And so, yes, I mean, when you guys were talking before about your sort of like top 3 players or 3 untouchables, apologies. Wilson's not one of mine because I'd be curious what other teams would offer. But like I said, it's got to be a lot. My guy, it's Ovechkin, it's likely Carlson, and it's Sandin. Those are my 3 that no one's touching because I want a guy for the future. In terms of like the Wilson, the trade from Toronto, what Russian machine they were talking about, I was like, I could see why that would be interesting. And if I'm Maclellan and I get a phone call, not from the dude in Toronto anymore, but whoever's next, if I get a phone call from Toronto and I'm going, all right, I'll hear you out. I'm curious what you're going to offer, because right now I don't think anything is off the board. I think they're going to look at it and go, maybe let me think about it. How would this lay out? You're going to kind of move around some guys and see where they're going to line up and see what your top 6 could look like. I think knowing or not knowing who the next head coach is going to be and not knowing what they're going to want to do with Kuznetsov and Mantha, it's hard to say what you do with Tom Wilson, because if you bring in a right winger for Kuznetsov, for example, that could play in your top 6, does that free you up to potentially move out Wilson to bring in a center to replace Kuznetsov? I'm confusing myself as I'm saying it. And then does McMichael start on the wing like they did with Backstrom when he first came up, like they did with Marcus Johansson when he first came up? They put them on the wing until they got more comfortable at the NHL level, and then they slid them over into the center spot. So I think there's the possibility that we could see a guy like Tom Wilson moved out, but I got to get that text from Brandon saying that they traded Tom Wilson and then see like a long list of what they've gotten back, or like Connor McDavid or something crazy like that. Like, it's got to be someone where I'm like, I get it. I get why they made this choice.
All right, that was a part one of the interview with Brandon and Dan. There'll be more to that interview in the coming weeks. Are you an everydayer of Locked On Capitals? I would sure love to hear from you. Hit me up on Twitter at DanCaps218 or at Locked On Caps and say, hey, Dan, I'm an everydayer of Locked On Capitals, and I will give you a shout out on Friday's show. When you're done with this show, head on over to Locked On NHL, available 5 days a week on your podcatcher of choice and on YouTube, as they have you covered with the NHL and the Stanley Cup. And then if you are a fan of other DC sports, there is Locked On Nationals, there's Locked On Commanders, and Locked On Wizards. So we have you covered with the Locked On family of podcasts. Once again, I want to thank you for joining me on this edition of Locked On Capitals, where it is your team every day. My name is Dan Holme, and I'll talk to you again next time.